Hi, I'm Neil Hermes, and in my bird wrap this week I've got 4 really curious and interesting stories. One about Whimbrels, one about parthenogenesis or virgin birth in birds, very curious story. A story about the Collins Street peregrines, and my final story about Eastern Rosellas. Hi, I'm Neil Hermes, and welcome to my weekly bird wrap. My first story today is about Whimbrels. Now, Whimbrels are a shorebird, or that means a bird that feeds along the shoreline. They often have very long bills, they probe the mud, or they run in the surf and they catch small arthropods and other sea creatures along the edge of the water. So Whimbrels are one of the larger shorebirds. They are a bird that breeds right across the northern hemisphere, in northern America, in northern Europe, and in northern Asia. And they breed during the northern summers, and then populations of this bird then travel down to different parts of the southern hemisphere for their winter. So some will travel down through North America, some will travel down through Europe into Asia, and some will travel down through from northern Asia into places in as far south as Australia. The population of Whimbrels is probably around 800,000. It's close to 1 million birds. Right across the Arctic when they're breeding. But separate populations go down to different parts of the southern hemisphere. And in North America, the total population of birds that travel down through the Americas is about 60,000 or thereabouts. So it's a very small part of the population, and they breed in a separate part of the Arctic. 60,000 birds. I was reading only recently that this year 20,000 Whimbrels have gone to a wintering ground in the USA on one location. So that's a third of the population of the Whimbrels of North America are on one tiny island just off South Carolina, just off Charleston, on an island called Devereux Island. It's effectively just a sand spit. And I just think it's an extraordinary thing. This is a relatively rare bird in North America. They spread out right through the Gulf country or through the Gulf of Mexico. But this particular group has decided to make its home in this part of South Carolina, and 20,000 birds, that's a third of the population in the world, is using this roosting site. And what it does show is that these small areas, an area less than 100 hectares, are critically important for some of these species that migrate and use wintering grounds. So it's fantastic to see these huge flock, at least one huge flock of Whimbrels in North America at the moment. A fantastic story. My second story also comes from the US today, and it's a remarkable story about parthenogenesis in birds. Now, parthenogenesis in common language is virgin birth. And we know that fish and reptiles, a female can produce young that then breed. So we do know that in lower mammals, lower vertebrates, that there are some species that can produce fertile young with only one sex present. It's been very rarely recorded in birds. In some captive birds like chickens and turkeys, etc., where there is only one sex kept in cages, there have been cases of eggs being laid which were infertile, fertile but then didn't develop. But this week we read that the Californian condor, this remarkable huge bird, the largest flying bird in the United States, in captivity has produced, at least we know of now, 2 birds that had only a mother and no father. Now, we know this because the genetics of the American condor is now so well known. The American condors got down to less than 20 birds back in the 80s. The whole population was taken into captivity. There's now about 500 birds, and we know the genetics of every bird. When you have a captive breeding program, it's critical to understand how to breed birds together. We all know that there's problems if you have breeding from too closely related animals and the problems that can create. So they study the genetics of these birds very well. And in looking at the genetics, they discovered that 2 of the males that they produced had no male genes in them. All their genes came from their mother entirely. Now, these birds they lived for a number of years, they didn't do particularly well, and both are now dead. But in doing the study, they now realise that in this population of 500 birds that we now know we have, at least 2 of them have been produced just by their mother. And it does raise the question about whether or not some species, and now particularly in birds, when you get down to critically low numbers, whether the production of young by one sex is part of an evolutionary system to try and help a population survive. A really interesting new area of genetics, but critically important when we're looking at endangered birds being bred in captivity. My next story today is concerning the peregrine falcons that nest in Melbourne. These famous birds, you may have seen the stories that I've got on my website concerning the Collins Street birds. The peregrines that nest on the high building and are tracked by a web camera which people can watch. The great news, of course, in the last week is that the peregrines have had their chicks hatch out and fledge, and they're finally now out in the world. And the peregrines at Collins Street have been successful in producing yet another clutch. And it's been a delight to see the reactions that people have had on the website, on the Facebook pages and the website concerning those birds. However, there's been a very fascinating twist in the story about the peregrines in Melbourne this year. In the footage that's been coming in, it's now obvious that you can see from the footage what species of birds that the peregrines have been feeding their young. Now, typically peregrines feed on pigeons, and domestic pigeons around cities are the most common bird that's caught and fed by the peregrines to their chicks. And hundreds of domestic pigeons or feral pigeons are captured by the peregrines every year. Of course, pigeon fanciers in the area don't like this, and pigeon fanciers don't like peregrines very much. But where they're domestic birds living around in big cities, people don't have much of an issue with the peregrines eating the domestic pigeons. However, what we can see now is that they're actually feeding on other birds as well. And this week, it's obvious that what's been coming in to feed the young just before they were leaving were some Latham snipe. Now, those of you who follow my blogs and my website would know that Latham snipe is one of my bucket birds and one of the birds I talk a lot about, because they have this amazing migration between Japan and Australia every year. And there's quite a small population of them, and they're a fascinating migrant that travels that long distance every year, and we're doing extensive studies on the Latham snipe. Sadly, some of these birds, when they arrive after that great journey from Japan, are now being captured by peregrines and then fed to their young. Curiously, the young didn't seem to like the Latham snipe much. They preferred the pigeons. But it just does go to show that we put a lot of our personality and a lot of our emotions into these interactions, and sometimes the things that we see aren't the things that we necessarily want to see in the wild. But it is a brutal place, and that's what happens in the wild. My last story today is about Eastern Rosellas. Now, this is an Australian bird, potentially one of the most beautiful birds on the planet. Eastern Rosellas, very common bird in Eastern Australia. Australians who have Eastern Rosellas in their yards tend to take them a bit for granted. But you know what? This bird is spectacular. It is a really gorgeous small parrot. The white throat, the red back, the mottled green and yellow on the back. It's just a beautiful bird. Have a look at the pictures attached to this story. A really lovely bird. Widespread on the east coast of southern Australia. They breed in the springtime. They can have between 3 and perhaps 9 eggs in a clutch. Typically of any bird that has its eggs inside a hollow, the eggs are all white. There's no need for the birds to have camouflaged eggs when they're laying them in a hollow or in a box. And this week, I have a good news in my own backyard. I have a box that last year had Eastern Rosellas nesting in it, and this year the Eastern Rosellas have arrived. They've now laid eggs again, and I can see the male is very excited. He flies around the nest box with this sort of fluttering of the tail as he's courting the female. There's a lot of mutual feeding goes on, the male feeding the female. So that activity is happening in my garden right as we speak, and I'm going to bring you some stories about those eggs and chicks as they progress during the year. And hopefully they'll fledge some young. Last year they fledged 3 young. I watched them leave the box, and this year potentially that we'll get some successful fledging from that box. So watch this space for the story about Eastern Rosellas. And before I finish, don't forget, if there's any stories that you'd like me to answer a question about, just press the Ask Me button on my website, flick me an email, let me know the stories you'd like me to either cover in the wrap or stories you'd like me to tell you more about. And don't forget, Christmas is coming up and my book is available online as well. So thanks for watching and happy birding.